Hello my dear friends, and welcome to another video from Neura Skills. In this video I'm going to talk about the history of EEG. Please, EEG looks modern, but the story actually started more than 200 years ago. At that time, people did not know the brain used electricity. Many scientists thought the brain was something mysterious. But something interesting happened in the 17th century. Scientists were doing experiments with frog muscles, and by accident they discovered that living bodies can make electricity. And this discovery was very important because later it helped other scientists build the tools we use today. My friends, a scientist named Luigi Galvani was working with frogs in his lab. One day, the frog's leg suddenly moved when the metal touched the nerve, and Galvani thought this meant animals have natural electricity, and he called it animal electricity. At that time, this was a very surprising idea, and this event was the first step toward EEG, even though nobody was thinking about brainwaves yet. After Galvani's strange discovery, more scientists became curious about electricity inside living bodies, and one of the most famous was Alessandro Volta. He was also from Italy. Volta did not completely agree with Galvani. He actually believed that the electricity did not come from the animal itself, but from the combination of metals that Galvani used. But here is the interesting and funny part. While he was arguing with Galvani, Volta actually created one of the most important inventions in science, and it was the first electric battery. This new invention, my friends, made it possible for scientists to control electricity better in the laboratory. Now they did not have to depend on lucky accidents. They had a constant source of electricity that they could use anytime. And even though Volta disagreed with Galvani, his invention helped electrophysiology grow very fast. And during the early 1800s, scientists started building new devices that could detect very tiny electrical signals. One of the very early instruments is shown here. And this picture shows a strange setup with a frog preparation connected to metal wires. It looks very simple and homemade, and it's almost like something from an old medical museum. But it was incredibly important. And this simple device allowed experiments that showed electricity inside living animals. One of the most important early devices was called a galvanometer, and this could move a needle when electricity passed through it. It was the first tool that could show electrical activity in a visible way. The needle movement was very small, but it proved that electricity inside the body was real and not only imagination, as someone like Volta said. So on the left you can see the legs of a frog connected to metal wires, and when electricity was applied to the nerve, the frog's leg moved even though the animal was dead. And this effect made Galvani believe that animals have their own natural electricity. And the big wheel in the middle is a spark generator, which was used to produce electric charges because electricity did not come from a plug like today. And the glass containers on the table are Leyden jars, and they were the first devices used to store electric charges. Scientists would charge these jars and then send the electricity into the frog nerve to see what happens. Every strange looking object in this picture had a purpose: to make electricity, to store electricity, or send electricity into the nerve. Then another very important figure entered the story, and he was Emile Du Bois-Reymond. He used galvanometers and other sensitive instruments to study electricity in muscles and nerves, but his contributions went far beyond simply using existing devices. During the early 1840s, he designed experimental tools that solve major problems in studying animal electricity. For example, he introduced non-polarizable electrodes, they were made from zinc sulfate and clay, and they were built to avoid contamination from contact electricity, and he developed precision devices like the record and a highly sensitive galvanometer that could record extremely small nerve currents. Between 1841 and 1843, he used these instruments, and Raymond showed that nerves change their electrical state when they send messages, and it actually distinguished a resting state from an active state. And his work launched a new experimental discipline, which was electrophysiology, and shifted neuroscience toward a mechanistic, measurable, and quantifiable, grounded science. Raymond's dramatic public demonstrations, in which a galvanometer needle jumped when a human subject tensed a muscle, astonished observers in Berlin, Paris, and London. And these presentations helped spread his ideas across Europe. As you can see in the photo, the experiment is set up to show that the body produces electrical signals when a muscle contracts, and the subject here places their hand in two small containers, which are saline solutions, and they act as conducting baths. Metal plates inside the bath connect the body to the wires leading to the galvanometer, and the arrows drawn in the figure show the direction of current flow through the person's arm and upper body. When the subject tenses a muscle, an electrical signal travels through the nerve and muscles, and that tiny change in voltage passes through the circuit. When the muscle contracts, the electric current makes the galvanometer needle move, and it shows the presence of an electrical signal inside the human body. This setup was interesting because it made the invisible electrical activity of nerve measurable and observable in real time. And during this time, other new instruments appeared. One very interesting example is something called a capillary electrometer, and it actually looked like a small glass filled with liquid, and the liquid moved when the electricity changed. It was very slow and not very accurate, but for scientists in the 1800s, this was a major tool. When an electrical signal passed through the device, the liquid inside the tube would move up or down, and even a very small electric change could make the liquid shift a little bit. So scientists realized that this movement could be used to show tiny electrical signals that were too small to feel or see in any other way. But the capillary electrometer had problems. It was slow, and the liquid sometimes moved too slowly to show quick electrical changes. It also produces curves that were difficult to leave. But the real revolution came with something called the string galvanometer, which was invented by a Dutch scientist named Willem Einthoven. Einthoven used a very thin metal string placed inside a magnetic field. When electricity passed through this tiny string, it moved slightly. Then the beam of light was reflected from the string onto photographic paper, and it produced a line that showed how the electrical signal changed over time. For the first time, scientists could record very small and very fast electrical changes in real time. And as you can see in the picture there, we are looking at one of the earliest complete electrocardiogram systems, and this was built in early 1900s, and it was based on Einthoven's string galvanometer. The patient sits behind a large table filled with equipment, and to connect the body electrically to the machine, his hands and one foot are placed in buckets of salt solution, and these jars act as electrodes, and they allow electrical currents from the heart to pass safely through the salty water into the recording device. And in the center of the table, you see the main recording apparatus. Inside this box is the famous thin metal string, which is suspended in a strong magnetic field. And when the heart produced an electrical impulse, the current passed through the string and causes it to move slightly. Because the string moves only tiny amounts, a beam of light is reflected upon it and it will project its movement onto photographic paper. And this thin line becomes the first accurate recording of heartbeat, what we now call an ECG or EKG. All of these inventions, from the capillary electrometer to a string galvanometer, slowly pushed science toward one big question: if nerves and muscles produce electricity, could the brain also produce electricity that we can measure? And this is exactly where a new scientist emerged in the history. His name was Richard Cotton. He was a doctor in Liverpool, England, and he performed some of the very first experiments that showed electrical activity coming directly from the brain itself. It was long before EEG became a real science. Around the year 1875, he began doing experiments on the brains of animals, rabbits and monkeys, and most scientists were focused only on nerves and muscles, but Cotton has a different idea. And he believed that maybe the surface of the brain might also show electrical changes related to brain activity. So Cotton carefully placed the small electrodes directly on the expected surface of the brain in these animals. And this was a risky method because surgery and electricity were still new in science, but his results were amazing. Cotton noticed tiny fluctuations and small electrical changes that looked different depending on what the animal was doing or experiencing. And these were some of the first true recordings of electrical activity from the brain itself. Cotton also made another very important observation. He noticed that the surface of the brain, especially the gray matter, had a small electrical positivity compared to deeper parts of the brain. And this means the surface was a little more positive in terms of electricity. He then made a very interesting statement about brain function. He wrote that the electric currents of the gray matter appear to have a relation to its function. This idea was very modern for that time. What he meant was that electrical signals in the brain were not random. They were related to what the brain was doing. And today this seems really obvious to us, but in the 1900, it was a very big discovery. Cotton also used a term that sounds similar to modern EEG language. He described something he called negative variation. And this was basically his way of describing what we now call event-related potential shifts. And these are electrical changes that happen when the brain receives a stimulus or does a task. Cotton continued his experiments for several years, and in 1877 he published an even larger report. In total, he studied more than 40 animals. They were cats, rabbits, and monkeys. And in these experiments, he noticed that the brain's electrical signal changed depending on the animal's state. So, for example, he saw different electrical patterns during sleep, wakefulness, anesthesia, and even death. And this was the first time someone showed that the electrical activity of the brain changes depending on consciousness. Cotton also tested how the brain responds to different kinds of stimulation. He gave food to the animals and saw changes that he believed related to smelling the food. He also touched the skin and noticed electrical changes when he pinched the lips and cheeks. And this means he was already observing what we would now call sensory evoked potentials. And in this way, Cotton was not only the first person to record electrical signals from the brain, he also became the first EEG brain mapper. Even though he did not use the word EEG, he already began connecting electrical signals to different regions of the brain. Another important step happened in Kiev, in Ukraine, and a scientist named Neminsky performed experiments in the early 1900s and made photographs of brain waves in animals. And these recordings looked much closer to modern EEG waveforms. Neminsky's results showed both spontaneous brain rhythms and evoked responses, and he helped introduce the idea of using photography could capture brain activity. It was very important later for someone like Hans Berger. And at this point in history, scientists were still not able to show brain waves on a computer screen because computers did not exist, so they needed another way to capture the brain's electrical activity over time. And this is where photography becomes extremely important. Neminsky used a very clever idea. So he, instead of just watching the needle move, he used photographic paper to record the movement continuously. Light reflected from a moving part of the instrument, and this light created a dark line on the paper as time proceeded. So this line is very similar to what we now call an EEG waveform. By the early 1900s, the scientist community was finally ready to accept the idea that the brain produces measurable electrical signals. Many researchers across Europe has contributed pieces of evidence step by step, but there was still another major step left: recording brain activity from a living human brain. And this great step was taken by a German scientist named Hans Berger. He would soon change neuroscience forever by recording the first human EEG. He was a German doctor, worked as a psychiatrist. He became interested in the brain in the early 1900s. At first, he was trying to study electricity for medical science. He was actually trying to understand how the mind works, and he believed that thinking and feeling must create some kind of energy in the brain, and he wanted to measure this energy. My friends, Berger started placing small electrodes on the heads of individual people, on the heads of living people, including members of his own family. He tried many times to record electrical activity from the scalp, but the signals were very small and hard to measure. It took him many years of studying and improving his equipment. And finally, in 1924, he was successful. He recorded the first electrical signal from a human brain without any surgery. Today, we call this the first human EEG. In his recordings, he noticed a slow and a regular wave when the person was relaxed with eyes closed, and he called these alpha waves, and scientists still use this name today. Berger also tried to measure EEG from many other situations. He recorded people with eyes open, with eyes closed, during rest, during mental tasks, and he noticed that alpha waves become weaker when a person opened their eyes or paid attention to something. This was a very big discovery because it showed that EEG was connected to mental state. It was not a general brain activity. He continued studying EEG in many conditions: sleep, epilepsy, and brain injury. And he noticed, for example, that epilepsy showed strong spikes and rhythmic discharges. And he suggested that EEG could be used clinically in neurological disorders. And this idea later became extremely important in medicine. And it was around 1924 that Berger finally began recording directly from human subjects. One of his first attempts was a 70-year-old patient who had a surgical opening in the skull. He used silver electrodes to the scalp, but the first attempt were not very successful, and later he recorded from another patient, and many recordings still failed. But little by little, Berger improved the electrode design and the sensitivity of his equipment. He experiments with many kinds of electrodes: silver plates, zinc plates, and metal needles. And his early electrodes often had huge electrical resistance, sometimes 10,000s of ohms, and this made EEG recording extremely difficult. So he tried many tricks to lower his resistance, and he used salt solutions, large electrode surfaces, double-coiled galvanometer, and this new device could detect much smaller voltages, and he gradually became able to record clearer and clearer signals. He did many recordings on himself, more than 50 traces on himself. He used different kinds of electrodes. He also recorded from patients with several neurological conditions, and in 1929, after many years of experiments and failed attempts, he finally published his first scientific report of human EEG. His publication included EEG from a patient with a tumor recorded in 1924, and although these recordings were not perfect, they were the first published examples of electrical activity from a living human brain. Berger's results clearly showed rhythmic brain waves, and they were not explained by the pulses of scalp or heartbeat, and the signals came from the brain itself. So he did not suddenly invent EEG in one moment. It took him more than 20 years of changing machines, changing electrodes, and learning how to reduce electrical resistance. He recorded from himself, animals, patients, and slowly learned to make the signals visible. And when he finally published his results in 1929, he officially began as a scientific field and the modern history of brain recording from that point. Thank you, and see you soon.